Hi everyone, my name is Jen. I'm an author and a book reviewer, and it is that time where I'm here to talk to you about my favourite books of the year. Last week I uploaded a video talking about all my reading stats, so if you want to know what formats I read in, what genres, what else, like how many translated books I read, lots of pie charts essentially, including a huge wrap up for the last quarter of the year, because I hadn't done a wrap up in 3 months. I'll link that video in the description box down below. But last year I read 165 books, and I've gone through all of those and I've selected the ones that have stayed with me, that I think are brilliant books for a variety of reasons, and obviously I'll talk about each individual book as we go. Some of them I admire because of the way that they are written and how rich and lyrical they are. Some of them I admire because of how much they gripped me and how much I adored the characters, and some are a combination of all of those things. We have lots of different genres here. I will list everything in the description box down below, and I would love to know what your favourite books were of 2022 in a comment as well. Not all of these books were published last year, though some of them were, but I read all of them for the first time in 2022. So 16 is about 10% of the books I read, so it seems like a good number. Let's dive in and go from least favourite to favourite. All right, coming in at number 16 is a book that I read near the beginning of the year. I did a reading vlog where I read other booktubers' favourite books from 2021, and this was one of Sophie's favourite books over at Portal in the Pages, and it hasn't left me. Like, I don't think this is the most brilliant book I've ever read, but I found myself thinking about it all the time, and therefore I think it deserves a mention. This is The Need by Helen Phillips. If you've read Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam, then it has that same unsettling quality to it, that haunting, makes you feel as though there's someone standing behind you when you're reading it. It's about a woman who is an archaeologist. She's at a dig, and they've been digging up these weird artifacts that are very similar to things that exist in our world but are slightly different. So Coca-Cola bottles but with different labels, Bibles where passages are just slightly wrong, and they're not sure why this is happening. So we jump between those scenes with her at work and then scenes with her and her kids at home where someone has broken into her house and is wearing this lovely mask here. If you have watched the TV show Dark, which I enjoyed to begin with, and then I think it got convoluted and I didn't like it very much, but I really like the premise. If you like Dark, I think you'll really love this. Before I put it down, let me just read you what Emily St. John Mandel says on the back of this. She says, "A profound meditation on the nature of reality, a fearless examination of parenthood, and also, somehow, a thriller? Extraordinary." That sums it up very well. Number 15, we have a short story collection. This is Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love by Huma Qureshi. This is a brilliant book about relationships of all kind and all of the unspoken things you do not say within those relationships. Sometimes it's nice unspoken things, you know, maybe you're a bit shy around each other and you don't want to tell each other how much you care about each other. And sometimes it's biting your tongue and not bringing up past events and going over old ground because you know you're just up in an argument that will go round and round in circles. My favourite short story in this is the second one, which I think is just called Summer, and it's about a daughter who invites her mother to come on vacation with her and her family because she's so fed up with her mum saying how brilliant her sister is. Her sister seems to get all of the praise, whereas she, the narrator, is the one who helps her mum out the most. So she's feeling underappreciated, undervalued, and she knows that if she invites her mum on this holiday, they're going to fight, but if she doesn't invite her, she'll never hear the end of it either, so she can't win. So you know that there's going to be an explosion at some point and you're just waiting for it, and when it comes, I mean, it was brilliant. I think it is one of the best short stories I've ever read, that one. It was just incredible. Next, at number 14, we have a poetry anthology. This is 100 Queer Poems edited by Andrew Macmillan and Mary Jean Chan. I'm part of this book. I am one of the poets. I'm so thrilled to be included in it. So I am slightly biased, but I'm not picking it because I'm in it. I'm including it in this list because of all of the fantastic array of different voices that we have in here. As the title would suggest, 100 different poets. And Mary Jean and Andrew have broken it up into sections like queer childhood, queer adolescence, queer cities, queer landscapes, queer histories, queer futures. And it's just fantastic. You'll be able to find a home in here if you're a queer person. There is something in here for everyone. Also, if you're not queer as well. But you know, finding yourself in books is such a joy. So next we have at number 13. Is that where we are? Number 13. We have Creatures of Passage by Merowa Yejide. This was my favourite book from this year's Women's Prize longlist, and I was perplexed when it did not make the shortlist. That's also how I felt about some other prizes, which we'll get to in a bit. But justice for this book. This book is fantastic. This is about a woman called Nephthys who had a twin brother who died. She drives around in a taxi collecting lost souls. It's almost like a death taxi. And she is reunited with her nephew, and she finds out that her sister-in-law perhaps needs some help. It is about family, found family. It's about power and how people abuse that. It's about racism, and it's about exercising evil from within a community. And there are lots of references to Egyptian mythology in this, which I also adored. Next on the list, we have Woman Eating by Claire Kohda. This is probably the best vampire novel I've ever read. I can't say I've actually read a huge amount of vampire novels, but I've read a few, and this one is definitely my favourite because it's very different. It goes in so many unexpected directions. I actually listened to the audiobook of this one as well, which is narrated by Katie Leung. So in this, we are following a young girl, or you think she's young, called Lynn. She presents as a 20-something woman who is attending art school. She has recently put her mum in a home because the doctors think her mum has dementia. Lynn isn't sure if her mum has dementia because her mum, like her, is a vampire, and she's not really sure that vampires can get dementia. But she's panicking because her mum isn't really controlling what she says, so she keeps on saying strange things to the nurses who are looking after her, saying she wants to, you know, for instance, drink people's blood. And they're very concerned, thinking that she's delirious, whereas Lynn knows that actually she's just forgetting that she's supposed to pretend to be a normal human being. So she's trying to adjust her life as an art student whilst also looking after her mum, but also wanting to break free from her mum because she's been attached to her for forever, because vampires live forever, and now she really wants to set out on her own and make her mark in the world, but at the same time she's not sure how to do that. She's not very sure in herself. She doesn't want to kill people. She wants to continue drinking animal blood, which is what she's been doing for the vast majority of her life, but she's finding it really difficult to do that as well. There's a lot of Malay folklore in here, especially when looking at the history of her family and also of vampires. And the vampire lore is tied up in discussions of racism in this book as well, because sometimes Lyd is unsure as to whether someone has clocked that she's a vampire and they're scared of her, or she's just encountered a very racist person who is projecting things onto her and hasn't realised that she's a vampire at all. There's just so many wonderful things explored in here. It's quite a short book, but it manages to dance in lots of different directions, and I loved it for that. The next book on my list is a very quiet novel, and I don't have loads to say about it. I would just say that if the premise intrigues you, don't read too much about this book, just pick it up and have a go. It's not very long, and if you enjoy, for instance, Tesha Moshfegh, I think that you would like this. It's about an unnamed narrator at first who works at a gallery. She's a cleaner. She really wants to be a writer. She wants time to write. So she decides to marry a man that she's not overly keen on so that she will have time to write. We don't know what period this is set in, and that's one of the things that I'm most intrigued about with this book, because sometimes it feels like it's a Victorian novel, then sometimes there's a phrase which makes it sound like it's quite modern. I like how deliberately ambiguous it is. Whenever you think you might be settling into the narrative, the author will just do something to pull the rug out from under you, and I thought that was really, really fun. The narrator in this describes everything as if she's looking at a painting. She's been so used to looking at paintings, working at the gallery, and she thinks that maybe she can understand life if only she can write about it in a certain way. I just thought this was so charming, so thought-provoking and lovely. I would recommend reading it. A book I would also recommend, but I would also say it will make you cry a lot. This is We Don't Know What We're Doing by Thomas Morris. Clearly this year I was enjoying short story collections with really long titles, because what was the other one called? Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love. Also, I mean, my short story collection, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night. Maybe I just like short story collections with long titles in general. This is one that I had been sleeping on because it's been on my shelf since 2015. It's set around or about the inhabitants of a small Welsh town. Some of them still live there, some of them have left, but it's about the pull that this place has on them wherever they happen to be in their lives. It's about the relationships that they have with other people, and again, things that maybe they're too timid to voice, and sometimes that can land them in quite difficult situations. Several stories in this book made me sob. If you enjoy Rachel Joyce's writing, I think that you will like this. If you enjoy Caris Bray, I think that you will like this. If you want to read about family, you want a realist collection, and you maybe want a cathartic experience, then may I recommend this. Another book that made me sob was Nightcrawling by Leila Mottley. This again was one of my favourite books that was longlisted for a prize, this time the Man Booker, but it was also not shortlisted. This is a novel about a teenager called Chiara. She's trying to work out how she can support herself and her family. She has an older brother called Marcus who isn't being very helpful in bringing money into their house, and she's also trying to look after her friend's son. Her friend is an addict and she's quite neglectful of her son, and often Chiara will come home and he will be outside her front door, and she's very keen to care for him and look after him, but at the same time she's really only a child herself. This is a novel about desperation, what a character will do when all of their choices are going to land them in all different kinds of trouble, because at this point their choices, which do not feel like choices at all, are all rubbish, and Chiara is privy to seeing how different people in similar situations to her are treated depending on other factors in their life. So for instance, she is a young black woman, so she is treated a certain way by white police officers that she comes across. She also encounters white sex workers and see how they are treated differently. And then she also has a friend who is trans, and she sees how they are treated differently again to her. So she can see all of the unfairness in society. She doesn't have the tools to tear it down, but she so wishes that she did, and she's trying really, really hard. This book, at one point, there is a scene that actually, I'm not going to talk about it because it's a spoiler, but just even thinking about it makes me want to cry. I don't remember if I said that this is a debut. It is a debut, and there are things that I think could be tightened and tweaked, but that just makes me so excited for what Leila Mottley is going to do in the future. No pressure, because she's just released this one. Obviously, have a rest and all that, but I'm very, very, very keen to read whatever she decides to put out into the world. Next on my list, we have What Willow Says by Lynn Buckle. This was the winner of the 2022 Barbellion Prize, which is a prize that celebrates work by disabled and chronically ill authors. Also work about disability that may not be own voice, but primarily its own voices writing, and a great resource for finding brilliant disability books. This is a novel about a grandmother and a granddaughter. The granddaughter is deaf, and the grandmother's come up with this informal sign language that they can use, just the two of them growing up living in the forest. And the sign language is very much informed by the nature around them, the way that trees move, and inspired by folklore too. So there's a lot of discussion on nature and folklore in here. There's also a lot of focus on gaps. So gaps in communication and understanding between the two main characters. But then as the grandma starts to look outward, the gap between the granddaughter and the outside world, and maybe how her inventing this sign language for them to use is going to end up being quite selfish, because the granddaughter can't use that to communicate with lots of other people. So the grandmother has to sacrifice, or what she feels is sacrifice, part of their closeness so that she can allow the granddaughter to, in this case, actually get a hearing aid, because a hearing aid is helpful to her form of deafness. Allow her to learn official sign language and talk to people outside of their little bubble. She knows that that's what the granddaughter needs. It's that feeling of loss that all parents, guardians, grandparents feel as their younger generations go out into the wide world, but it's illustrated through this medium of communication and language. And I just thought that was so beautiful, this process of grieving but also loving deeply and wanting the best for those around you, even if that means that you feel like you're losing something yourself. Just loved it so much, and it was a great discussion around deaf culture and accessibility as well. Brilliant. Another book that was a great exploration of deaf culture is this book here, which is The Silent House by Nell Pattison. This is a crime novel, and I read this nearly in one sitting. If I hadn't needed to go to sleep, I would have read it all in one setting. This is about a BSL interpreter called Paige Northwood, who is called to this crime scene at a family home where the youngest daughter has been murdered in the night. This family is deaf and they weren't aware of anyone breaking in during the night. Paige is there to communicate between the family and the police. She is the only hearing member of her family. She's been part of the deaf community all her life, and the deaf community in her town is a very tight-knit one. So tight-knit, close-knit, I think both of those work. So she knows everyone who is involved, maybe not very closely, but she's aware of them and also is close to people who were close to them. So she's very heavily emotionally involved in it and trying not to be, because she wants to help as much as possible. It is a great crime novel. I guess some things, but not others. And obviously, because this is a known voices book, everything happened so organically and it made sense. And you didn't have that distraction of reading a book that isn't own voices where the representation is just not good. So it's brilliant representation, a wonderful story, kept me on the edge of my seat. And then I ended up reading all 3 books in the series and just enjoyed myself, had a great time, would recommend. Next on my list, we have Untold Night and Day by Suah, and this is translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith. This is told over the course of one night and one day, and our narrator works at a theatre for the blind. It's an audio theatre, which she's worried is going to be shut down, which she thinks means that she may lose her job. So she's feeling quite directionless. After work, she goes to visit a woman, and then through the course of the night, she ends up wandering around Seoul, encountering maybe the same character or versions of the same character again and again. They're almost stock fairy tale characters that can be used to help her understand her life and also highlight how hazy and blended her life feels. Reality and chaos are kind of colliding, and she's not sure which side of that dynamic she's going to end up on. It makes you feel like you're jet lagged reading this book because phrases are repeated over and over again. It's almost like this is a book that has been placed over itself on tracing paper, maybe translated and mistranslated in places deliberately to trip you up. It's like a puzzle that you have to solve or a dream that you can't wake up from. And I just loved it. And quite similarly, actually, the next one, which is Ghost Music by Anne Yu, was also one of my favorites. This is a novel set in Beijing. It's about a woman called Song Yang who gave up her career as a concert pianist when she got married, and now she teaches piano to children. She's trying to work out whether or not she wants to have kids, and her husband is saying he doesn't really want that. And then one day his mother comes to stay with them, and she brings all of her husband's past with her, past that can't really cohabit with them in that space. Like, she's a representation of everything that came before her in his life. And I just feel like that extended metaphor, that image throughout this book is very relatable to a lot of people, but also handled in such a surreal way. She starts getting deliveries, Song Yang, of mushrooms one day, and she doesn't know why they're arriving at her house, and she decides to track down the sender, and that leads her on this very eerie journey where she also has to confront her past in order to move forward, and that's tied up with ghosts and music and mushrooms. And I promise that all of that makes sense when you read it. Again, it does feel a little bit like reading a fever dream. Number 4 on my list, we have Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Au, which is a very short novel about a daughter and a mother who decide to meet up in Tokyo. They haven't seen each other for a while. They're going to go on this holiday, but But again, like other books that I have mentioned in this pile, apparently my catnip is that I like reading books where people do not express themselves properly. And I don't mean in a really infuriating way whereby if someone just told someone some secret or how they're feeling, everything would get resolved. That just gets on my nerves. But I'm talking about the realistic holding back, tiptoeing around each other, trying to work out situations, not start a fire, or, you know, remind yourselves of how your relationship used to be if you're trying to repair it. That kind of unspoken stuff. So the daughter and the mum, they meet up. They're both on their best behavior on this trip. They want to have a good time. But at the heart of their relationship, there is this sandpaper texture, which means that they do just get on each other's nerves, and that's okay, but they don't realize that that's okay. So they just keep on trying to amend their own behavior until they're not really sure what they're doing anymore, and everything just feels a little bit fake. They have to take some time apart on this trip so that they can, you know, do some deep breathing. So they'll go off on beautiful autumnal walks, they'll eat some wonderful Japanese food, and then they'll come back together again. It's almost like their roles are reversed as well. The daughter becomes the mother becomes the child. I just loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it. Number 3 on my list, we have Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer. I cannot believe that this book is a debut. It's outrageous. This is a novel about a woman called Leah who's interested in etymology. She is married, she has a teenage daughter, and she's recently been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. In this novel, cancer has a voice. It's part of the text, and the voice it has is Ted Hughes's Crow. This book has clearly very much been influenced by Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. You could even say that this is the prequel to that. Different family setup, but prior to the mother dying, because at the beginning Leah knows that she isn't going to survive. At some point the cancer is going to kill her. So obviously this is a very difficult topic, and if this is not a book that you can approach, I completely understand that. But for those who can read it, may I recommend this book. The way that language is toyed with is fantastic. All the references to Ted Hughes and to Wuthering Heights, which isn't a book that I enjoy, but I like how other people play around with it in novels. That's wonderful as well. I think I said in the Man Booker video that if Virginia Woolf was writing today, I swear this is what she would be writing. It's that kind of flowing narrative that just has so much to say and leaves you feeling completely in awe of it. So if that appeals, put that one on your TBR. Number 2 is a book that I read really recently. I read it just before New Year, and I always have to pause with books that I think might be favourites if I've read them really recently, because of course you need time for books to settle a little bit. But I'm very confident with the placing of this book in this list, and this is Still Missing by Beth Gutcheon. This is published by Persephone Books, who publish classics mainly by women, forgotten classics. And this is a book that was published in the States in the 80s, so it's quite recent for them because they often publish books from like the 30s and 40s. This is a novel about a woman whose son goes missing. The child in question is called Alex. This is a quote about Alex from the very beginning. Alexander Graham Selke Jr., age 6 3/4, a freelance spaceman, a small sturdy child with a 200-watt smile and a giggle like falling water, a child who saw Star Wars once with mummy, twice with daddy, and once again with TJ, owner-trainer of Taxi, an oversized Shetland sheepdog. So Susan is the mother of Alex. Susan sends Alex off to school. One day he only has to walk 2 blocks to school. She walks him 1 street and then he turns the corner. She lets him go off on his way. She goes to her job. He never makes it to school. She doesn't know that until he doesn't return home. She recently broke up with Alex's dad, and this novel follows the weeks after his disappearance. And I don't want to say too much about it because obviously it's a crime book and we're going to tiptoe into spoiler territory, but all of these characters felt real to me. Every single one of them, I was convinced that they existed. I know that this is based on a real life case, but it doesn't follow it really very closely, and it deviates in lots of different ways. So it's not as if the individuals in this book are based on specific people. It's just taking inspiration from a case that happened in the 80s. But this book made me so nervous at various points because I didn't know where it was going. It's also an exploration of how the police respond to crimes that they think may involve queer people. So we're looking at homophobia as well and how the characters deal with that. Like with Silent House, I read this in 2 sittings. It's over 400 pages, but I was obsessed and also so stressed, and I needed to know what was happening. This book is very, very 80s. It's so 80s. It made me sob as well. It absolutely made me sob. I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to give anything away, but if you haven't come across this book before, please may I recommend that you read it. Then finally, my favorite book of the year is going to be no surprise to anybody if you've been around here a while, and that is Elena Knows by Claudia Pineiro, translated from the Spanish by Frances Riddle. This was another book that was longlisted for this year's Barbellion Prize, or rather last year's Barbellion Prize. This is about a woman called Elena whose daughter Rita recently died. Everyone thinks that Rita died by suicide, but Elena thinks that she was murdered. So she decides she's going to spend a day trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. She wants to travel across the city of Buenos Aires to find someone who she thinks can help her. Elena also has Parkinson's, so this novel is split up using Cryptime. This book is split into sections that depict a period in time where she's taken her medication. So at the beginning of that section, once the medication starts working, she's able to more easily, not easily, but more easily for her, move her body. And towards the end of that section, and then for a big block of time, her body stops responding to what she's telling it to do. So she's unable to move. So that is her main consideration as to how she's going to navigate her entire day, utilizing the time when she can move more freely. And it was just a fantastic, fantastic book that is about caring in lots of different ways. So it looks at care and disability, but it also looks at mother-daughter relationships and the care that goes both ways in that relationship, whether some people perhaps are just not cut out for caring, or maybe if you haven't nurtured someone in a particular way, then you won't get that reciprocative care later on. Elena is a very complicated character herself. Like, she's not a likable person. She has a lot of internalized ableism, and as a reader that throws up a lot of things because obviously you sympathize with her in various different ways and you want her to succeed, but then she'll also do something that's very infuriating. So I liked all of the directions that it pulled you in, and again, definitely made me cry a lot. So those were my favorite books of 2022. As I said, I will list them in the description box down below. If you enjoyed this video and you're new to my channel, I would love you to subscribe. That would be great. And if you like my content and you would like to consider supporting me on Patreon, there's a link to that in the description box down below. I would love to know about your favorite books. Please do tell me. Thank you for being here, and I will see you for another video next week. Lots of love. Bye.